Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled Student-Centered Learning with Madeline Hunter's Model. My name is Dr. Heather Machetta. Before we begin, I would like you to consider your entire educational career as a student, from preschool up until now. For some people, this may be taking you back a little ways. Think of one lesson that stands out as being particularly effective. Specifically, what made that lesson effective? How was it designed from start to finish to make it stand out for you? If you would, pause the webinar and think and/or write about this lesson. We will be coming back to this activity, so please keep your notes handy. Welcome back. Madeline Hunter's model of lesson design is one of the most traditional, being that it's been around since the early 1980s, and it is still one of the most widely used. Many school districts have adopted it as the standard lesson plan format. But in the age of the 21st century learner, lessons should engage students more than the traditional model of direct instruction that the Madeline Hunter model was originally used with. In this webinar, we will discuss each of the seven components of the Madeline Hunter lesson design model, which you see listed here on this screen, and we'll focus on how to make lessons student-centered. The first element of the Madeline Hunter model is the anticipatory set. This is the hook to grab the student's attention at the start of the lesson. The intent is to put the students into a receptive frame of mind, and this is often done by relating the student's prior knowledge and their prior experiences to the lesson's objective. Some examples could be a brainstorming session where the students list everything that comes to mind about a topic. You could ask a provocative question and have the students write a response or discuss with a partner. You could review the main idea of a previous lesson and have students predict what comes next. You could show a video or an audio clip and have students respond. You could use an advanced organizer, which is a graphic organizer activity that's done before the lesson. Really, the possibilities are endless, and the anticipatory set allows you, the teacher, to be creative in engaging the students. Remember, though, it's really important to keep it short. It should only be long enough to get the students focused and interested so that you can spend the major portion of the instructional time to accomplish the lesson's objective. Here's an example of an anticipatory set that may be used in a social studies class or an economics class. This is a word cloud of the Prime Minister of India's speech that was delivered on August 30th. You could ask the students to either write or discuss what similarities they see between India and the US in terms of economic issues. You may need to remind them that in a word cloud, the larger the word, the more frequently it's used in the text, or in this case, in the speech. After the anticipatory set and before any actual teaching, you must communicate to the students what they will learn and include why it's important, why it's useful, and why it's relevant. I think the key is the relevance. Students need to know why they are learning something. As students ourselves, haven't we often asked, why do I need to know this? When you state the objectives, it clarifies for the students why they need to learn what you are teaching them. We have discussed in the past how to write objectives, so let's take a few minutes to review the ABCDs, which are the components for developing lesson objectives. I'm sure you remember A is for the audience, that's the who, generally it refers to the learner. The B is the behavior, that's what will be done. Remember, it must be both observable and measurable. One of the biggest errors teachers make in writing lesson objectives is that they don't write the behavior in the objective to be observable or measurable. C stands for the condition. These might be the tools that will be used to perform the behavior. And D is degree. That's the how well. The degree sets the standard for acceptable performance. So let's take a look at a sample objective. And I'd like you to go through the A, B, C, D and identify whether or not they are in this objective and whether or not they are written correctly. So take a moment, read this objective, pause the webinar, and analyze the A, B, C, D of this objective. So here's the sample objective. After viewing the PowerPoint, students will understand the correct procedure for writing a lesson objective. So let's quickly go through the ABCD. Is the audience identified? Sure, that's the students. What about the behavior? Well, behavior is identified as the students will understand, but it's not an observable behavior. But it's very easy to change that. You could change students will understand the correct procedure to students will be able to demonstrate the correct procedure. It's definitely observable to see the students demonstrating the correct procedure for writing a lesson objective. What about the condition? After viewing the PowerPoint. And degree, absolutely, it's in there, the correct procedure. So I'm sure you were able to pick out that all four of those elements of a lesson objective are there, and hopefully you were able to point out that the behavior was not observable, but again, easy to change that from understand to demonstrate. After you state the objectives for the students comes the instructional input. This is when you identify and teach the main concepts and skills. Often, it's direct teaching through clear explanations, examples, diagrams, graphic organizers, discussion, but it doesn't have to necessarily be direct teaching. However you do it, there should be frequent checks for understanding through formative assessment, and the teacher should invite as much active student participation as possible. Unfortunately, the Hunter model has taken some criticism over the years, but usually that criticism has come because the instructional input section of the lesson was used as lecture. And we all know that students do not respond well to lecture. It's not an effective way to engage students. But if you can actively engage your students during the instructional input, it contributes to the effectiveness of the Hunter model. So you as teacher need to determine how to deliver the information. It could be through a presentation with questions to keep the students involved. Students could complete a graphic organizer as you are delivering information. You could do some kind of a demonstration with student input or have the students demonstrate. You could do cooperative learning activities or discovery and inquiry, all of which are very, very student-centered. So I'd like to take a moment and have you pause and reflect. Think about the lesson that you identified in the opening of this webinar. Specifically, what instructional methods did the teacher use to deliver the instruction? And what made them effective for you? So if you would, pause the webinar, reflect on the effectiveness of the actual delivery of the information. I ask you to do this because we often teach in the same style in which we learn best ourselves. This can be good because it tends to highlight our passion for the content and the material that we're teaching, but it can also be dangerous to favor just one or just a few teaching methods. Remember, it's really important for us as teachers to adapt our instructional delivery to our students' needs and differentiate as necessary. So I ask you to reflect on what works best for you, just so that you can be aware that, for example, if cooperative learning is a style that works very well for you, you don't rely only on cooperative learning. You may use it sometimes, but you don't use it for every single lesson. You use a variety of different instructional delivery methods to engage your students and to differentiate to their needs. Next in the Madeline Hunter model is the modeling. This is providing examples for students to apply the concept. Modeling is most effective when it's paired with labeling, which is when the teacher, as they go through and model the activity, the teacher identifies the critical elements of what they are modeling. This keeps the students focused on the essentials. Generally, to do this, the teacher uses a think aloud strategy to focus the student's attention on what he or she is doing. And you'll see an example of this in a moment. Next comes guided practice, which is critical as the students begin to synthesize the content for themselves. Guided practice is so important because the teacher's role is to catch any errors that the students make before these errors become ingrained and therefore difficult to reverse. Guided practice can take on a couple of different forms. It could be the teacher guiding the whole class through several problems or through an activity. Or it could be the students working individually or in small groups with the teacher circulating to answer questions and check their work. No matter how you do it, guided practice should be differentiated. The teacher can tailor the problems and the activities to different learning styles, different student interests, or different ability levels. This video is about 4.5 minutes long, and it shows an excellent example of a teacher modeling a poetry analysis activity while engaging the students in discussion, and then a very student-centered guided practice activity which she calls poetry workstations. As you watch, pay attention and note how she involves the students in the modeling activity and how she monitors and guides the groups at the different stations in the guided practice.
Hello, I'm Carrie McAllister, and I teach elementary language arts at Bonnie Cole Elementary. This great lesson idea is called Poetry Workstations. Today we are going to be focusing on poetry, and we're going to be reflecting on it. We're going to be using inferences, Before going into workstations, I took the students through a process of reviewing what poetry is and what it means, and then actually doing and analyzing a poem with them so that they had a good background and foundation before they went to practice it on their own. Poetry is an imaginative awareness of experience expressed through meaning, sound, and rhythmic language choices so as to evoke an emotional response. This lesson I would use towards the center of a poetry unit where the students have a little bit of background knowledge about poetry. What figurative language do you see in the poem? What figurative language?
When the poem says the road was grass, a road can't want something because it's not alive unless you think about the grass. So it's just comparing it to what a human might say.
So let's take a look at your workstations that you're going to be doing. To practice using your inferences with poetry, bringing your schema connections, asking questions about what you're reading. The 3 groups and 3 workstations were the iPod workstation, the techie workstation with blogging, and podcasting workstation. In the iPod workstations, I put some poetry and motion videos on there where the students were able to choose the poem to watch, and then they were using their poetry reflection questions and sticky notes to reflect on the poem and analyze and think about what the poem meant to them.
You sort of get to visualize the poem in a different way. Like if you read it, you just read it. But if you actually see it happening, you can hear it, and sometimes hearing poetry, it's more meaningful than just reading.
When the students were working on their podcast, they had previously done a poet study where they had analyzed a poet, read a bunch of his or her poems, and in this station, they were trying to pretend to be this poet or put themselves in the shoes of the poet so that they could create a radio show or an interview or a video podcast or audio podcast, basically sharing their thoughts and reflections about the style of the poet and reflecting on their poetry.
I'm recording my poem, and then I'm gonna talk about how I thought that Robert Frost felt when he wrote this poem, and then probably gonna do a radio show.
I'm gonna talk about it and say what some of the analogies and metaphors and stuff. Different people, poems can mean different things to every single person.
In the blogging workstation, the students were able to reflect on a poem. They had a choice between a humorous or serious poem, and they were commenting, once again, using their guiding reflection questions, but not only giving their ideas, but once their classmates posted, they could go back and forth in an online discussion, asking questions and commenting with each other.
Which words feel important? Say if you were reading a poem about a dolphin. say there was a happy poem about a dog. It would say, this poem made me feel happy, or this was enjoyable because da 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 da. Fill blank.
This lesson was really about giving them an opportunity to practice and analyze. We're going to kind of have a little bit of a reflection discussion just so that you can implement this lesson in your classroom. I'm going to share my lesson plan, my presentation, and resources with you.
Join us next time for Spotlight on Poetry.
I just love how the guided practice activity is so student-centered and so engaging for the 21st century learner through the infusion of technology into each workstation. Every student is actively involved, and students are able to explain what they are doing and why, and that is so important. We need to see that from every student in every lesson. It may seem a little odd that the closure activity is not the last part of the lesson, but it is the last formal part. This is when students are given the opportunity to think about and verbalize what they've learned. So what does closure look like? It can be a summary, an exit ticket, a review through Think, Pair, Share, a self-reflection, or a number of other conclusion activities. Like your anticipatory set, you have the opportunity as teacher to be creative in having the students demonstrate to you what they have learned. Depending on what you did for your anticipatory set, you could return to it and have students compare what they knew before the lesson to what they know now, or somehow make a connection to the anticipatory set. That might give the lesson a nice sense of coming full circle. Closure is important to help students organize their learning. They know when they've come to an end, or at least a pausing point in a lesson. And it also helps to reinforce the major points or the objective. It must be carefully planned so that you don't run into, well, there's the bell, that's the end of today's lesson, which often does happen, unfortunately. So make sure you plan a good 3 to 5 minutes for an effective closure activity. And finally comes the independent practice. It's important to note that you may need to reteach, or you may need to teach a series of connected lessons before students are ready for the independent practice. So every lesson may not have the independent practice component. Independent practice should be a meaningful activity in which students apply what they've learned to a different and or a broader context. They can work alone or they can work in groups, but the key is that they work without the teacher monitoring their process. Some examples of independent practice could include a project, a writing assignment, a problem-solving activity, an experiment, a presentation, an independent reading and response activity, or any number of other activities that the students do independently. It's important to let them know before it's assigned how their independent practice will be assessed. And like the guided practice, all independent practice activities can and should be differentiated based on learner needs. This YouTube video shows an entire lesson that follows the Madeline Hunter model. You may pause the webinar and watch the video now, or you can watch it at a later time that's convenient for you, since it is over 20 minutes long. I've included the link to the video in our course shell under learning resources for you to access it later. But I do recommend that you watch the video because it is a good example of how a teacher seamlessly moves from one to the next in each of the 7 elements of the Madeline Hunter model. So as a closure activity to this webinar, I'd first like you to reflect. Return to the lesson that you identified in the introduction activity and think about, maybe write down, how was it similar to the Madeline Hunter model and how did it differ? And then once you've completed that, I'd like you to review. Explain 3 ways in which you can use the Madeline Hunter model to make a lesson student-centered. And you will use this review activity as part of your assessment activity, which I'll go over on the next slide. So if you would, pause the webinar for a moment and reflect and review. And finally, your assessment of what you have gained from this webinar is for you to participate in the online discussion forum titled Student-Centered Learning with the Madeline Hunter Model. The prompt you'll respond to is to discuss a lesson in your content area in which you would use the Madeline Hunter model. How would you design that lesson to ensure that it is student-centered? After you have written your original post, you will read other students' posts and respond to the posts of at least 3 classmates. And you'll find that in the discussion forum section of our course shell. If you have any questions about this webinar, please feel free to contact me via email or phone. My contact information is also available in our course shell. I look forward to hearing from you. I thank you for attending this webinar, and until I hear from you, have a great day.